So when I started working with Father Andrew Seferny in the Center for Norbertine Studies about a decade ago, one of the first things Father Andrew told me was, Michael, you need to reach out to Carol Neel. He said she is the preeminent American scholar on Norbertine studies, or Norbertine history, medieval Norbertines, and she's an excellent Latin linguist, medieval Latin scholar. You'll learn a lot from her. And I was like, cool, all right, I'll do that, And then flash forward a few years later, I take over the position as director for the Center for Norbertine Studies, and I reached out to all the former directors and I said, are there any individuals that I should, do you have any advice for me, any individuals I should reach out to form partnerships? And across the board, they all said, Carol Neel. Reach out to Carol Neel. Make sure she's on speed dial for the center. I mean, we don't use that term speed dial anymore, but you know what I mean, speed dial for the center, that she's there to form collaborations with the center, with partnerships with, and I was like, absolutely, I totally agree. And over the years that I've had opportunities to work with her through events and committees, that high praise is definitely well-deserved. She is an excellent, terrific, very gifted scholar, very passionate on the subject matter of Norbertine studies, Norbertine history, medieval history, and she's a champion for this field of the Norbertine studies. And I found her to be, over the years, perpetually kind, humble, and generous with both her time and her expertise. And I have thoroughly enjoyed every opportunity I've had to work with her. So Dr. Neel earned her bachelor's from Bryn Mawr College and her master's and Ph.D. from Cornell University before joining the history faculty at Colorado College, where she's been there ever since. Her teaching and research spans European Middle Ages, historiography, and classical and medieval Latin literature, but her primary scholarly passion lies in the spirituality, reform movements, and the life of religious orders in the 12th and 13th centuries, particularly the Premonstratensians. Her list of accolades and honors and publications is quite extensive. She's held a number of distinguished positions, such as the William R. Hochman Professor of History from 2015 to 2018 at Colorado College, and she was twice a resident scholar for the Collegeville Institute for Ecumenical and Cultural Research at St. John's University in Minnesota. Dr. Neel currently serves on the editorial board of the Premonstratensian Texts and Studies series, and she has published several books and articles on the topics of Premonstratensians, including, I'll just list a couple of the books that I definitely think you should check out. A 2007 book titled Norbert and Early Norbertine Spirituality, which she translated and co-edited with Father Ted Antry from Daylesford Abbey. A 2010 book, Anselm of Havelberg's Antikymenon, The Unity of Faith and the Controversies with the Greeks, which she edited and translated with Father Ambrose Christ from St. Michael's Abbey in California. And in 2011, she edited the English translation of Francois Petit's Spirituality of the Premonstratensians, the 12th and 13th centuries. And for those of my students out there, you're thinking that sounds familiar. Yeah, that's the book we're using in class. So that's her. That's that book. And then more recently, in 2020, she published a really fine article in Brill's A Companion to Medieval Rules and Customaries. The title of the article is The Premonstratensian Project. And I could go on, but I think you understand just how valuable she has been to the study of Norbertine history over the years. So I am deeply honored to introduce to you our 2025 Heritage Month lecturer, Dr. Carol Neel.
Thanks very much. Thank you, Michael. Thank you, Emily. Thank you, Father Matthew. I'm delighted to be here tonight. I hope you aren't disappointed, but that's going to stay here tonight. It says St. Norbert, so that's a good thing, and it's topical. But I don't have slides tonight. There's not the live action of St. Norbert meeting Anselm and Philip, my chief topics tonight. But that's not really the reason that I don't have slides tonight. I would like this to be a conversation. I will speak some, but I want that to be the first element in the conversation. And then I hope afterward you will ask some questions, either here in this room or subsequently informally, because I want this to be between you and me and not on the screen. I actually asked that the lights be turned up because I'm aware it's after dinner. And but be here with me, and I wish to speak to you and have you not watch something other than me because it will be more real that way. And I want to introduce you to some of what I consider to be the most important themes in the history of the Norbertines in the 12th century. All right? Are we good? Okay, good. So this evening I'm honored to be speaking with you in the context of the Heritage Series here at St. Norbert College. I have worked, as Michael mentioned, on Norbertine history, or as historians usually say, Premonstratensian history, for a long time, since I chose a dissertation topic on a 13th century member of the order some 45 years ago. But this occasion offers me, and I hope all of us gathered here, an extraordinary opportunity to bring together past and present. We are at St. Norbert College, an institution framed in the long liberal arts tradition. It is named after Norbert of Xanten, a medieval figure who was himself the product of the most compelling revival of ancient liberal arts tradition in European history. And now we find the liberal arts challenged, many would say imperiled, by political controversy and a deep cultural suspicion that they are not appropriately utilitarian, that they foster a kind of alienation from the real, from due professional ambition, and that those who teach them are at once architects and captives of some kind of intellectual incarceration that begs to be broken for the good of the whole society. Is there a way, we might ask, that the vibrant revival of the liberal arts in the time of St. Norbert, 900 years ago, might offer us some suggestions about where the liberal arts are today and where they might go? Tonight, I want to ask that question and to begin to answer it in full awareness that the Middle Ages was long ago and far away. How could that heritage possibly be something students, and there are students here, I'm glad to see there are students, even professional academics, think might be relevant to teaching and learning in the liberal arts context now? When I introduce myself to people outside higher ed, even to some of my young colleagues, I always say I'm a European medievalist. But then I often follow that description with a sort of apology. Don't worry, it's not contagious. I'm only partly kidding, but honestly, I don't want to seem scary that as a medievalist, I am bringing you a sudden Viking attack or a little bit of Black Death. That said, tonight I want you to catch a little of the Middle Ages, to make medieval studies contagious, and to argue for you that Norbertine Premonstratensian tradition speaks from the heart of both medieval experience broadly speaking and of liberal arts expression across centuries, holding up a worldview and a sense of human possibility useful to us today as we ponder the future of the kind of education in which all of us here tonight are invested. To approach this matter advisedly, we need first to consider what we know about the first Norbertine canons of the 12th century. And there we are duly cautious, I know you know this, because off the bat, we confront the elusiveness of Norbert of Xanten, who left behind no written word. St. Norbert remains, and here I quote one of the most eminent of living historians of medieval thought, Bernie McGinn, the least known of the major figures of the 12th century. To a certain extent, St. Norbert's obscurity in the historical record has to do with his own spiritual and intellectual ancestry, in that he and his followers understood themselves as heirs of the greatest of ancient Christian theologians, Augustine of Hippo. They cast themselves as revivers, revitalizers of a model much older than their own time, in contemporary terms maybe revenants, rather than innovators. They stood tall, we might say, but behind Augustine, a very large figure indeed, in that he wrote some 5 million words across a long career up to his death in 430. Augustine was himself a teacher of the liberal arts, and his works were and are a fountain of interesting material in that regard. So part of our task is to characterize the 12th century revival of Augustine's model of the liberal arts, as Augustine knew and directed them, and as the first Norbertines interpreted his model. Here we want to focus on the Middle Ages rather than late antiquity. So in the context of the patchy documentation of St. Norbert's life, we face real obstacles in our inquiry about his and his early followers' relationship to the liberal arts tradition, as Augustine of Hippo knew it. But I promise you, We can make this documentary silence an eloquent advantage. Norbert was foremost an actor, a historical agent, and we can read his actions. Still more profitably, we can interpret what his friends and followers said about his model, further about the relationship between the state of their world and education for their times. And this evening we can understand their medieval language, so to say, in a modern idiom. I teach at a college where discussion of what the liberal arts might mean on the ground and my colleagues and our students work together is always active, often exciting, occasionally conflictual. Those are the nice words. That is as it must be, as I am sure it is here at St. Norbert College. We all understand that the phrase liberal arts means a way of looking at the world from multiple points of view, sharing a conversation about it by valuing different perspectives, and understanding that a liberal arts vision is at once privileged and privileging, that it is a kind of study appropriate for, quite literally, free people gifted with the opportunity to seek such learning, and in turn, honored to serve others with its fruits. Augustine himself understood the liberal arts in this way, artes liberales, the ways of understanding the world that enable free persons, liberi, to exercise their innate freedom, libertas, to the fullest extent. The 12th century, in which European readers understood Augustine's legacy with a depth and resonance none had since antiquity, embraced both parts of that liberal arts vision, its reception as a birthright of free people and its recompense as their obligation to engage with the world in a way no readership had since his own time. In the very moment of St. Norbert, the famous Paris theologian Peter Abelard wrote an autobiography exploring his own feelings in a fashion directly imitative of Augustine's Confessions. Abelard was only one of many Europeans who took the great African's mastery of the verbal arts in particular as a pathway into exploration of an interior self. So similarly, Norbert of Xanten, with his generation's fresh appreciation of the magnitude of Augustine's transhistorical voice, took the great African's rule for religious life as the foundation of the spiritual community he founded at Premontre. But what more can we say about the medieval Norbertines and their educational model than that their first founder, the Augustine whose model St. Norbert himself embraced, was a practitioner and advocate of the liberal arts. Of the 7 liberal arts the ancients grouped as the verbal threefold way, the trivium of grammar, dialectic, and rhetoric, and the fourfold way, the quadrivium of arithmetic, geometry, music, and astronomy. Here you might wish to look at your handout, which has a nice picture of these things. Not only did Norbert leave behind no reflections on his own learning, but the bulk of his performance of his faith and community building lay outside of what we might call education, strictly speaking. Yes, we have 2 12th century lives of Norbert, closely related, neither in this context especially useful. Indeed, we can glean from these early hagiographies certain principles we might label as distinctively Norbertine thought. The centrality of community, the cultivation of dialogue, a commitment to peacemaking, the fruitful duality of contemplation and active commitment to the church and the world. But these are moral postures rather than educational principles, and by themselves are more commonplaces of European Christian tradition than the sort of edgy, effective, galvanizing notions that explain Norbert's distinctiveness and the powerful impact that he and his followers made on the 12th century world, especially with respect to education. If we set Norbert and his early followers in their immediate historical context, though, we find that this shadowy, schematic image of their goals with respect to learning is suffused with depth and color. Here some storytelling is in order about St. Norbert himself and those with whom he surrounded himself. As 12th century evidence suggests, Norbert had an extensive and varied career before he gathered many men and women around him at Premontre, and then, leaving behind that vowed religious community he had established, set off toward Magdeburg to lead the expansion of a frontier church. Of course, and rightly, scholarship about him from the point of view of the history of the Order of Premontre has elevated the aspects of his experience as a secular cleric, an imperial courtier, a seeker after religious conversion, then a pilgrim preacher striving to settle those inspired by his message into an ordered community life, above all as the order's founder. But tonight, we might look to other aspects of his experience as we know it from the hagiography, other sources attesting his influence, but also from the works of those closest to him, and from our investigation of the contemporaneous culture of the region between German and French-speaking lands from whence he came. And when we do, we find that perhaps surprisingly, Norbert was a hit with students, liberal arts students, who were at that historical moment, for the first time in European history, a lively, numerous, and influential group. And we know that when St. Norbert showed up on what we would call a campus, students flocked to him out of the bars and grills, or perhaps I should say the medieval analogs to cafes and the college library, because of course none of the students here at an institution named after him ever go to bars. And I do want you to understand my general drift. We also know that the most well-documented and articulate members of Norbert's immediate following, Anselm of Havelberg, who went on with him in his last years to what was then the eastern frontier of Christendom, what is now eastern Germany, and Philip of Harbecht, who stayed behind in the Walloon heartland of the early order in today's southern Belgium, were students when he scooped them up into his compelling charism. We might at first think that they left their studies fully behind, that they abandoned learning to pursue a spiritual life because they realized that such education was not for them. And to some degree that is true, in that they both afterwards spoke and taught a radical prioritization of their interests and values according to St. Norbert's model. But a reordering of values is not their abandonment. And here we want to see how that worked, and to note that Norbert himself had done the same, that he had been the beneficiary of an education in the liberal arts, and then after some time experienced a conversion causing him to rethink what that learning served. Neither he nor his disciples, those whose testimony to the early Premonstratensian charism are the closest surviving reflection of his personal model, ever spoke against liberal arts tradition. On the contrary, that educational frame was part of Norbert's followers' essential makeup, just as it was of his own, integral to that spirituality as it had been to the thought and belief of their ancient first founder, Augustine, whose religious rule they and their master Norbert embraced. To put that another way, Norbert of Xanten was a big draw as a speaker at liberal arts schools of his own time, not only because his holiness was magnetic, but also because he shared a vision of the meaning and purpose of education with his academic audiences, and he elevated it. For the remainder of this talk, I want to focus on that. How was Norbert himself shaped by the liberal arts as the 12th century understood them? How did his immediate successors record a vision of how the relationship between the movement he inspired and his century's revival of learning should play out? In answering these questions, we're lucky to have help from Norbert's friends. I have already mentioned two of the saint's immediate followers, also architects of the Order of Premontre in its early decades. And here we will uncover their principal ideas on higher education. Philip's and Anselm's magnificent works, seen in reference to the 12th century liberal arts impulse, suggest to us, if not Norbert's own thought, the commonplaces and driving influences of those whom he first inspired. Here we may depend a bit on two of Norbert's modern friends as well, Stephen Jaeger and Rachel Fulton Brown, contemporary scholars with rich interest in Norbert and his followers, who will help us unpack broad elements in their experience. These old and new voices, Anselm's and Philip's, Fulton's and Jaeger's, hold up a medieval mirror to today's practice of the liberal arts we may find challenging, productive, even wayfinding. Jaeger in particular reminds us that the 12th century was a renaissance. Famously so called by the Harvard historian Charles Homer Haskins 100 years ago, that revival was foremost a renewal of European education. As the aftermath of the 11th century's Gregorian reform roiled both church and state, its dynamism fueled schools of the liberal arts born in cathedral churches and eventually maturing into universities still based in a liberal arts program inherited from classical antiquity. Norbert, soon after him Anselm and Philip, were all educated in cathedral schools of the liberal arts, a new and immediately famous phenomenon in which teachers who were generally secular canons attached to cathedrals in newly prosperous towns taught students from all around, not like older monastic schools, centrally their own young members. Anselm of Havelberg and Philip of Harbank, alike prolific authors and immediate followers of Norbert, criticized their generation's educational experience with the tools it gave them, as indeed he had done. As they argued, learning was a good thing, but the secular or even ecclesiastical institutional goals to which it was generally directed represented lesser moral and spiritual ends than human possibility enabled or divine providence ordained. Anselm and Philip saw themselves as agents of a providential reframing of what learning might mean in the broadest possible terms, as a force in the history of salvation. Their affirmation of the role of educated voices in shaping the world around them is the closest we can come to hearing Norbert's own sense of what education should do if we understand it in context. And that context was rich and productive, provocative. None of the earliest Norbertines went as far as did Hugh of St. Victor, their fellow regular canon, who stated baldly in the 1130s that study of the seven liberal arts potentially cured mankind of original sin, a perspective cheering for those of us in higher education, even if it is discordant with observed reality. It is worth noting that when the close followers of Norbert wrote about education and its fruits, they made no mention of an order of prémontré. Rather, like the Victorine Hugh, they addressed the role and the preparation of regular canons and even clergy generally, suggesting that they understood their particular network of religious houses as less important than their and other regular clergy's collective distinctiveness as against older models of monastic education. And they understood the role of those clergy as epochal, as history-changing in its modeling of a new worldview for all of Europe. Anselm of Havelberg, as many in this audience will be aware, was one of the 12th century's most innovative and adventuresome theologians. Here our interest lies less in his apocalyptic thought, in which he was directly inspired by St. Norbert, than in the way his description of the intersection of earthly time and God's eternity spoke to its implications for us here in the meantime, in the long wait for the end. Anselm's works are evidence for his own learning. Although he was likely a German, he was drawn in his youth to the liberal arts as taught in the Lower Rhineland, likely studying the eminent cathedral school of Liège. That vibrant center of trade and political turmoil was in the 12th century also a crossroads of European spiritual and intellectual adventure, closely connected with the teaching of Abelard himself, and sharing with Paris the legacy of the cathedral school at Chartres, the principal birthplace of the so-called Renaissance of the 12th century. There, as that school's famous master Bernard said, dwarves stood on the shoulders of giants as ancient learning was revived. The heart of the 12th century's approach to learning, as the early Norbertines experienced the medieval revival of the liberal arts, was its multiplicity, the array of disciplines that together, we might say, optimized the freedom and agency of those who acquired them. So the image you have is a famous one from a Benedictine abbess, but it is the best picture of the liberal arts, I promise you that. There in Liège, Anselm likely met Norbert, himself a product of the renewed liberal arts. Stephen Jaeger frames a broad interpretation of early 12th century education in a volume memorably borrowing its title, The Envy of Angels, from a description of cathedral schools by another Bernard, that most eloquent of medievals, St. Bernard of Clairvaux. Jaeger posits that first in the later 11th century and later across all Northern Europe in the early decades of the 12th, cathedral schools, exciting heavenly admiration, offered not just a wider access to education in the familiar liberal arts ongoing since classical antiquity in the monastic context. Rather, in Jaeger's view, those old arts, grammar, dialectic, rhetoric, or the language arts, then arithmetic, geometry, astronomy, and music, or the mathematical arts, were here newly understood as equipping Europe's leadership for something more than knowledge aimed centrally at supporting the reading of Scripture. Instead, enabling fundamental human improvement in a Europe redefining itself as aspirational, as better than Europe before the Gregorian reform, looking toward creation's completion in a coming apocalypse. The Gregorian reform undergirded the expansion of this non-monastic education as yet more ambitious. In the 12th century's cathedral schools, the liberal arts were taught to young servants of both church and empire as tools toward the fulfillment of Christendom. Hence, Hugh of St. Victor's wildly hopeful characterization of the liberal arts, but more immediately for us this evening, insight about the early Norbertines. For Jaeger, our own St. Norbert, properly speaking your Norbert, was a prime example of liberal arts education as cultivating the peak of human possibility. As Jaeger notes, St. Norbert's 12th century biographies alike stress in their first chapter, Norbert enjoyed the gift of nature in regard to the shape and suppleness of his body, preeminent in eloquence through his knowledge of letters, both vitae say. He showed himself gracious to all who knew him. While our first reading of this simple text might suggest to us that Norbert was in some general way handsome and well-educated, a more informed interpretation suggests that his knowledge of letters was a pointer toward the broad moral prospect of the liberally educated individual. We know from multiple medieval sources that Norbert had a 2-year sojourn in the ambit of the famous School of Philosophy at Laon, with its masters Anselm and Ralph. This after his own evidently rich education in the Cathedral School of Xanten. But in this regard, Norbert was, for Stephen Jaeger, and I believe should be understood by us, as paradigmatic of the 12th century ideal of learning, asking to what end knowledge should be directed, rather than by eliding his experience in a secular school. After his conversion, Norbert made a point of showing up at eminent schools, especially in Liège and Laon, scrapping on points of theology, and more importantly in our context this evening, persuading young students to follow him away from their studies alongside future secular leaders and ecclesiastical administrators, instead to live in religious community. We should not be entirely surprised. Plenty of people formed by today's elite educational institutions are motivated to criticize them. I mean no disrespect to St. Norbert to note that he shared this impulse with many public figures in the U.S. now. But in Norbert's case, and his followers, I argue that this direction took the form of extending, perfecting the goals of the liberal arts, rather than combating, erasing their impact. Jaeger's point bears pressing, that St. Norbert's conversion was totalizing, that he sought to complete the formation on which he and so many others of his generation had been launched by recasting it as an aspect of the unfolding of providence. Our evidence is indirect but compelling, and it comes first from Anselm and then from Philip, whom Norbert seems also to have won away from the literal halls of secular learning, likely in Laon in the north of France. Augustine stands behind this transit and Hugh of St. Victor alongside it, but Anselm and Philip together offer a perspective on a distinctly Norbertine vision of the value of the liberal arts. Let's spend a moment with Anselm first, then, because his works are older. In fact, the first extant literary or apologetic works from among the early premonstratensians. What does an apocalyptic theologian, arguably the first European thinker to expound a notion of progress in human history, also an apologist for a lofty role in Christendom for regular canons, have to do with advocacy of the traditional liberal arts inherited from antiquity, taught by Augustine, revived in his own times. Anselm boldly argues that the religious leaders of the 12th century, among whom his A-list is Bernard of Clairvaux and, unsurprisingly, his dear friend Norbert of Xanten, were harbingers of the end time, that their message of religious reform heralded that he and all his generation were about to be gathered up into God's eternity. And this was a reform inextricable from the work of the new schools of Northern Europe. In order to better understand Anselm's thinking, and by association St. Norbert's, we might listen to the voice of the other, still more prolific, early witness to Norbertine educational thought and direct reflection of St. Norbert's own. Philip, second abbot of the Premonstratent community of Bonne Espérance, lived much longer than either Norbert or his advocate Anselm, with a varied career extending into his 80s, so 30 years past Anselm's death and nearly 50 past St. Norbert's. Philip wrote a great deal in a style markedly different from Anselm's almost furious combativeness and clarity of apocalyptic vision, but his oblique and heavily ornamented prose, filling an entire volume of the Patrologia Latina, represents the direct commentary of a close associate of Norbert of Xanten on the meaning and purpose of the liberal arts. Philip's abbatial collations on the dignity of the clerical order contain a major section entitled On the Knowledge of Clerics, De Scientia Clericorum. Here it is important that we understand Philip to be referring not only to Premonstratensian canons ordained to the priesthood, but to a much wider swath of Europeans whose lives they touched. Like Anselm of Havelberg, Philip of Harbank never refers to an order of Premontre or any like term. Both wrote about themselves, their confreres, and their communities as by synecdoche for a renewed Latin Christendom, as a kind of leaven to renew an aging world and hasten its glorious end. And this notion was true in no aspect of their life more than in their approach to the liberal arts. Philip approaches this matter directly in talking about education for young clerics. He has a number of harsh things to say about students who do not commit fully to their learning, but on a more positive note, he claims the highest authority for his advocacy of study. He says, the Lord himself, although he chose his apostles while they were yet uneducated and completely illiterate, without letters, in order to confound the wise, nevertheless refused that they remain uneducated, rather strove to promote them to the profound secrets of knowledge in the procession of time. In Philip's series of Responsiones, his ideas on the progress of learning offer a tender and thoughtful response to his confreres' questions about what place learning had in a religious community. Those ideas are still more vivid in his sprawling commentary on the biblical Song of Songs. If a long musing on an Old Testament wedding song seems an odd place to find educational theory, then so be it, because here Philip argued stunningly clearly in a characteristically medieval, virtually graphic imagination for what he understood to be both the content and the context of appropriate education among regular canons and those whose learning was entrusted to them. As Rachel Fulton Brown has emphasized, Philip of Harbank's thought about the liberal arts and the Song of Songs is among the most startlingly adventuresome aspects of the 12th century's great upwelling of love for the Virgin Mary, an exploration of her meaning for religious and intellectual life. In sum, to repeat our earlier phrase, for human possibility. Philip's song commentary is the most assertively Marian interpretation of this mysterious and beautiful text in the Hebrew Bible. His work here is path-breaking in interpreting the bride of the song as the Virgin and the bridegroom as Christ himself, testimony to the creativity and innovation of Norbertines as framers of 12th century Marian devotion. But equally inventively, this work reframes the old liberal arts. In Philip's view, the ancient trivium and quadrivium, deployed in concert as in the famous visual representation by his contemporary, Herod of Landsberg, which you have, was best appreciated through allegorical interpretation of the song, where those arts appeared as handmaidens celebrating and supporting their mistress bride, the Virgin, in a creative recycling of the work of a late ancient author, Marcianus Capella. In Augustine's time, Marcianus had written a verse allegory, the story of a wedding feast, in which the liberal arts were the maiden attendants of a bride personifying learning in general. This all seems a bit abstruse to the modern ear, but our concern is with the Norbertine Philip, who reworks this story to replace that ancient goddess of learning with the Blessed Virgin herself. Philip maps Marcianus' allegory onto the Bible's Song of Songs as the dialogue of Christ and his Virgin Mother, interpreting their conversation as the convergence of the divine and the spiritual with the human and the intellectual. Philip redeploys the song's directly erotic imagery to talk about study, surrounding the Virgin Mother of Wisdom with attendants who are, like Marcianus brides, the familial liberal arts. Most importantly for us tonight, he tells this story, curious to the modern ear, to critique his contemporaries' passion for the liberal arts as not enough, to urge that they reach further. As Philip writes, they ought to know, those who inhabit the schools, that it is not enough for any one of them to study well if he does not exert himself with equal care and knocking at the above-mentioned sanctuary, if he does not for this reason read, love, and understand this labor, that with suitable progress he should want to knock to enter the bedchamber of the bridegroom, in which peace kisses justice, and the soul is joined to the word of God in the marriage bond. Take your learning further, Philip of Harvard urges, beyond knowledge of the world to contemplation of the divine. Here, though, for Philip, the Virgin represents not only the bridge between God's will and human aspiration, but also a direct model for the regular canons, whose special role it is to teach their own students, by extension all of Europe, by word and example, docere verbo et exemplo, a phrase this community knows well and which you rightly own. Philip might, we could imagine, have redrawn Herod's image to replace the Lady Philosophy at the center with Mary herself, to represent that Mary as the true philosophy. And indeed, the Virgin Mother of Wisdom is a later medieval and even modern commonplace. But it is important for us tonight that with Philip, with the Norbertines, this image is new. Appreciation of Philip's view of the liberal arts renders many other elements of long-standing Norbertine educational and ethical sensibility, the elevation of dialogue and reconciliation, the importance of spiritual affect, feeling, alongside intellectual accomplishment, the value of community, the more mutually intelligible. For him, the education of a regular canon, and by extension, the education of those nurtured by regular canons, should shape an exemplary human person more than impart knowledge, strictly speaking. But what might this perspective mean for Norbertine education as extended to a wider, even a lay community? Here is not the place to parse what the relationship might have been in the 12th century between the respective educations of clergy and laity. But fundamentally, while the Gregorian reform emphasized clerical difference from lay persons, it also emphasized the ordained clergy's leadership of secular society. In regard to education, that reform indeed saw its own time's cathedral schools and the liberal arts education they offered as a paradigm in which those ordained to the priesthood might lead Europe to a loftier spiritual as well as intellectual plane. As Stephen Jaeger, whom we have mentioned as noting St. Norbert as instantiating this 12th century ideal, also points out, he says, charismatic virtue cultivated in the liberal arts context met the realities of the 12th century as a moral imperative to perfect Christendom. If we were to embrace that hope for educational leadership seriously, we might project 12th century ambitions onto 21st century circumstances by first understanding Norbertine pedagogy as guided by principles the earliest premonstratensians embraced for their own young confreres and hoped for the broad secular community they served. Moral direction in this Norbertine charism, a vision of, again, charismatic virtue, raises the liberal arts to the stature of an imperative to the deployment of those arts for individual spiritual growth and contribution to Christian community. The 12th century Norbertines set out to rescue European education from the rapidly secularizing liberal arts, not by a return to the patterns of monastic education as more scripturally focused, but by redirecting the traditional arts toward the values central to St. Norbert's own teaching and model, reshaping what they saw as the soulless and instrumental approach to education in what their own times lauded as great schools. While in general the medieval Renaissance's educational ambition was to improve humankind's knowledge through an integrated program of disciplinary studies in verbal and mathematical arts, in Philip of Harbank's terms, it framed education as a yet more ambitious process of advancing humankind towards salvation through teaching animated by contemplative community and served by the liberal arts, imitating the Virgin Lady of Learning, the ultimate magistra, as a paradigm of teaching surrounded by bridal attendants embodying the aspects of learning. Intellectual tradition extending back to the Greek notion of a circle of learning and kukleos paideia was integral to this vision, its content inextricable from its moral and spiritual intent. Herod of Landsberg's Wheel of the Arts, as Philip and other regular canons understood this image, and as Philip of Harvank particularly eloquently argued, would carry humankind upward toward heaven. But in order to do so, it must be directed toward heaven rather than toward, we might say, graduation. This is all ancient history, or at least medieval history. But today, as in the 12th century, liberal arts education is a privileged enterprise, now as often before under siege for manifold reasons. It seems impractical, yet it is practical, because a rounded liberal arts education formed by contemplation, cultivated in community, and insight opened by dialogue might still undergird positive engagement in a troubled world, exactly as Philip believed. We meet new challenges, but our world is no less troubled, and teaching by word and example still might mean dedication to classical Christian learning as represented by voices and models committed to spiritual community and intellectual dialogue. These were the foundational principles of medieval Norbertine teaching. They are no less robust and relevant today than they were when the order was new. Our catalog of the ways in which these goals may best be sought in the classroom is carried forward by the reminder that they are at once so simple, so grand, and so fully expressed in the works of those who knew and followed St. Norbert himself. The liberal arts have been around for a long time in a variety of forms and under different names ever since the 5th century before the Common Era. Still more, since the ideal of a rounded education took on the form we can still recognize in Augustine's century. Those arts, those skills and experiences appropriate to a free person, a person competent to fully engage with the world, have been continually reassessed, now across more than 2 millennia. But my argument for you this evening is that they belong to you in a particular way, in which you may rightly experience pride for their extraordinarily generative history, but also humility at the responsibility that history implies. More than any other religious order, more certainly than the Benedictines and Reformed Benedictines, the Cistercians, for whom the center of gravity of the liberal arts would remain in scriptural study, the earliest Norbertines saw education in the literary and mathematical arts as key to humankind's future. They embraced that distinctly 12th century ideal more than did the Dominicans and the Franciscans who came along in the next century to carry forward the liberal arts in burgeoning universities, in which those skills were valued less for themselves than as foundational to other realms of study. Even as the early Norbertines centered contemplative community and ritual life in their religious practice, they fulfilled their obligation to share this educational ideal in the conviction that it might finally raise Christendom closer to heaven. St. Norbert, Anselm of Havelberg, Philip of Harvank, the voices of the order as it began to imagine its role in history, grounded their work in the belief that humankind could all be better, wiser, more decent, more like the Blessed Virgin, Mother of Wisdom, in the presence of the liberal arts as means to clarity of argument and awareness of the beauties underlying the created world. As liberal arts colleges pivot, as the study of the liberal arts have many times before, to respond to the particular needs of students of our times, You are especially privileged to remember that behind what is taught in data analytics or human performance is a history of the courage to reform the world born in religious life and galvanizing to secular society. I am not sure that any educational institution today might be said to be the envy of angels. Our world just does not think in those terms. But it is a thought worth holding and a challenge to this college community to embrace its own long history of ambitious leadership in the liberal arts enterprise. Thank you for listening.